Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Strength and Weakness podcast. Today, we are excited to be with you. Again, I'm Morgan, along with my co-host, Ellen, and we are bringing you a great topic, something that is really important to me today that I'm excited to chat with you about that will coincide with, a question that we got from one of our listeners as well. But before we jump into that, wanted to share a quick messy moment from my day today, which actually happened this morning. So I thought that the timing was very spot on. So my daughter's school just launched a week off to help aid with school absenteeism. And so typically, like on this 3-day weekend, people would take like extended days off, and then people would end up missing a lot of school. So had it in our calendar. My parents watch our kids, so we had everything squared away of like who was picking up who. It was all in my work calendar. Last week was a super long week. And even last night as I was going to bed, I said to my husband, I was like, all right, back to the grind tomorrow and back into the swing of our routine. So we wake up this morning, I get everybody's lunches ready, pack everybody for school. We were doing good on time. Traffic in Southern California can be really tough. And so I opened up my apps, my Maps app, and looked at the time to get to school, and it said 44 minutes, which is absurd. Usually it's 27. And I'm like, okay, let's see. And Siri told me to go this back road. Never listen to Siri when she tells you to go back road, because it added 20 more minutes than just sitting on the freeway traffic. I am racing. I have a 9 o'clock meeting I have to get home for. I am just feeling the pressure. And I get off the exit and I pull up to my daughter's school, and it hits me that she does not have school this week. And I forgot from last night to this morning.
My heart is beating so fast listening to this, because I know that feeling of we're going to be late. And then you get there and everything crumbles.
100%. I was just so mad at myself and so frustrated. And then I just had to tell all 3 of my kids that were in the car. And I was like, well, isn't this just so funny? And they got a kick out of it. They were just cracking up. And I was like, oh, to have a childlike heart. So then I'm rushing to my son's school, which is usually my second drop in the morning. And luckily, my parents meet me there. And so they ran in and dropped him off for me.
Goodness.
But it was just one of those mornings that I was like, how did I get here? And how did I forget? So hopefully.
Sounds like you need a day of rest.
Well, fancy you should say that, Ellen. Listeners, today we are talking about Sabbath and rest and how that coincides with sexuality and leaning into the messy middle that you'll hear a lot of us, Ellen and I, talk about often here on the podcast. But today that is exactly what we're talking about. How to engage with Sabbath rest when contemplating some of these issues that are really deep in our hearts, in society. So, Ellen, I want to pitch this question to you first. As somebody, I know that you practice Sabbath because we are friends and you've shared this with me before. But before you started practicing Sabbath, it's kind of a buzzword. What did you understand Sabbath to be before you started practicing it?
I saw Sabbath as something to steal my productivity, right? I thought God wanted to stymie my productivity and punish me in a way, right? That's what it felt like, was this punishment. I mean, truly, yes, I do practice the Sabbath, but not as regularly as I would like. It's tough with young kids and busy lives, but we do try to implement a Sabbath every week in some way. So it was a game changer for me to read John Mark Comer's The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry and Jeff Bethke's To Hell with the Hustle, which is very similar, because I learned that, wait a minute, Sabbath is not a burden that I must obey. That's kind of how I saw it. It was like this demand that God had that I should obey, and it was meant to be like a hardship, something to stymie my natural state of productivity. But I realized it's a gift from God that I can indulge in, and it takes my focus off of productivity, which is so necessary to live in this world, but under God's law.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I had a similar perspective when it came to what Sabbath was. And I think especially in a Christian community, And at least for me, like I didn't hear a lot about Sabbath outside of biblical stories that said, okay, on the Sabbath, Jesus healed, or on the Sabbath, this story happened. And honestly, I just was like, that must be some really old thing the Jews
Yeah, me too.
celebrated,
Yeah.
you know? And it doesn't apply to me now.
Right.
And I guess I should put the plug that like you'll hear a lot about John Mark Comer and practicing the way. If you have not looked into the resources, they're really great. But and a lot of what I'm going to share today, I've adopted from their practice, and like Ellen mentioned, the ruthless elimination of hurry. But I do think like it's not something that is meditated upon often, especially in Christian circles, at least from my perspective. I think we're growing more to get there, but I think just right, a lot of people who might be listening might be, one, not familiar with the term, and two, may have heard it, but may not know what it actually looks like. And so I just want to like take a moment and outline, right? The Sabbath day is a day of rest, and it's reflected upon creation and the day of rest that God took after creating the whole world. And we, in turn, are supposed to take a day of rest. It is true that way back in the day, in biblical times, and even, in biblical times, that the Jewish tradition was to not do anything on Sabbath. And there are lots of laws and lots of things around that they adhered to when it came to rules in practicing the Sabbath. But the whole premise is just to have a day to rest and worship God.
I always think of the word connection with Sabbath, right? Because it's a day. And yes, you're right. The Jewish law, right, as passed down by Moses, was observe the Sabbath, but it was a very ancient Jewish practice. And the Jews, that are still around now still practice this. It's called putting a fence around the law. So they didn't get close to breaking the law, right? So they added lots of rules to the Sabbath. You can only walk this many steps. You can only do this or that, right? And so I don't observe all of those laws in the Sabbath, but I do try to get to the heart of it, which is, to me, connection. We have 3 words that help to kind of facilitate or create our Sabbath day or Sabbath period together as a family. And it is cease, abide, delight, right? Cease the hustle, abide in God, and delight in what he's given you and your connection with him. So that reconnection, I think that's what we're all starved for in a world so far from Eden. We think we get it from scrolling social media and talking to people at the grocery store. And I think some of those meet that connection need in a way, but the deep level of connection that we were created for, to really abide in God and in his presence, we have got to be tapping into that regularly, certainly daily with God and some special time with him, but weekly in a bigger way. And I think it's been really helpful to see that in our lives.
Yeah. It's so interesting. Just recently, I've kind of had another shift in my perspective of Sabbath, because I also thought that I also thought that it was like I must not do anything. I must sit and rest. Like that I could not do anything, right? And again, being somebody who loves to thrive off productivity, I was like, okay, well, I cannot touch a dish that is in the sink, and I cannot pick up a piece of clothing that is on the floor. But I just read the book by Henry Nouwen called The Way of the Heart. And he talks a lot about solitude, but there was something that he pointed out that was really profound to me, which was just leaning into what you were just saying, Ellen, which is this idea of connection. And that can be building connection with relationships. That can be building connections with God, and things that are essentially like fill our buckets. And what was interesting to me about this is that I always viewed the rest as being Sabbath and solitude can go hand in hand, but I always viewed it as like, I need me time to rest. I need me time. I need to be alone. And if I can't be alone, then I cannot get fulfilled. And what I've learned in kind of this profound shaping that I've had over the last few months has been actually like, one, God wants me to love him. So yes, connecting with him, but he also wants me to love others. And if that means that every Sunday I have a family dinner with my in-laws or I have a family dinner with my parents, like that, it can also be Sabbath because I'm resting and I'm building and I'm delighting in the relationships God has given us. And again, these are healthy relationships that I enjoy. And so I think that it is very rebuilding. But just understanding that Sabbath is a time that we can rest and delight with God, and really like stop to listen and hear him.
That's another misconception that I had about Sabbath before I started practicing it, is that it had to look a certain way and had to be really strict and I had to do nothing. And now that I've been in the habit of practicing it, what I see is that often, if you're just a third party looking in, it looks similar to our regular Friday night, Saturday morning, right? But it's the intention behind it that makes all the difference. So I remember our first Sabbath that we did, we lit some candles just to kind of like set the mood. I had pre-planned a meal, so we didn't have to make it. And then we gave our kids a bath. But instead of like, hey, I'll go clean up after dinner, you bathe the kids, and then I'll get the room ready for bed and all this stuff, it was, let's just both sit in here and have fun with our kids while we give them a bath, right? And so it wasn't that we did something so different. It's that our intention behind it was not to hustle, not to hurry. It was to stop and enjoy the moment, abide in that moment, cease the hustle, abide and delight in it.
Incredible. Yes. And how I want to like transition us into this idea of like what's the intersection with sexuality and the essence of our ministry? Like, why are we talking about Sabbath today on our Strength and Weakness podcast? I have learned as we've practiced Sabbath and solitude that like if I am not intentionally stopping to rest and delight and connect with God, these issues of sexuality or whatever societal thing is going on, whether that's with me, whether that's with somebody I love, whether that's with the political climate of who's in office, whatever these big these big things that can elicit big emotions, I never stop to give them to God. I never stop to like usher them to his feet for him to help guide me through. Because that hustle just takes over. I'll just keep moving and moving and moving. So then, hypothetically, if I have this encounter with a situation, let's say I'm a parent and I have my child comes to me and says, "Mom, I'm same-sex attracted," because I haven't been laying these down before God or even processing them with him, and I've just been hustling through life, my tendency is to totally explode or to react or whatever that might be. And I don't have the capacity. I'm already at my threshold that I cannot respond in a loving way. I can't even stop and say, wow, thanks so much for sharing with me, right? And then respond the way that I would hope to. And so I want to lean into how do we make space for Sabbath so that we have more margin to take this tense topic that we are surrounded by. It doesn't matter what age you are, you are going to encounter this topic of sexuality. How do I make space to take this to God? And what does that look like in taking it to God?
Yeah. Man, I think you described just the modern problem in our current society. We're all at our threshold, like what a threadbare existence compared to what God intended for us, right? He intended for us to exist in this place of rest and full connection so that we can handle difficult things when they come, right? We have learned through psychology, our spirits, our hearts, our souls, our brains are made to withstand a lot of difficulty. We can exist in tension, we can work through difficulty, but when we don't have the mental, emotional space, spiritual space to reconnect with who God is, who we are, and what he's called us to, we're going to be operating at full capacity all the time, and we won't be able to respond in the way that we want to. We won't be the Christians, the children, the parents, the spouses, the friends that we want to be. And so that when you were talking about that, it made me think about, what does Sabbath do? I don't think Sabbath is some magical thing. It's not just about rest, right? I have clients that I see in therapy, and they think rest is sitting on the couch watching Netflix for an hour, right? That is not rest. That is relaxation, but that is not a soul level rest. I think rest in the context of Sabbath and God is connection, reconnecting. And I think what Sabbath does for me is it reminds me who God is, who I am, and and what he's called me to. And I think the word remember is in the Bible, like, I forget how many, I think over 300 or 400 times, but it's in the Bible over 200 times as a command. And if I had to break up what God asks us to remember in the Bible, it would be in those three categories. Remember who I am. I'm your God. You serve no others before me. Remember who you are. You are my child. You are loved. You are also unworthy of my love, but you've been given it, right? And remember what I've called you to. Live a life worthy of the calling that I've given you. And so when we step away from our daily life, like I feel this every time I go away for a little getaway, a little trip, I gain a new perspective on my life, right? I'm able to observe it from a different angle. I'm able to say, hey, I've been operating at full capacity for too long. I need to build in some more rest, relaxation, but also connection time in my life so that I'm not, resorting to those angry retorts with my children or my husband when I'm just at full capacity. And I feel like if we could build that in every week where we had time to connect with God and say, I remember who you are. You're my first love. Connect with who we are to him. I remember who I am. I exist in you. I'm your child first and foremost. And connect with what he's called us to. And that kind of falls under that umbrella of examining our life. God calls us to be men and women who examine, who analyze our life and make sure it's aligning with the way that we've agreed to live in him. How much more effective could our lives as Christians be? How much more effectively could we navigate big, scary, heavy topics like LGBTQ topics in our own life, in the lives of our children, our friends, our loved ones, or even just our society at large? So I love that you're combining these two, because I think that it's not just about rest, it's about that connection. Remembering who God is, remembering who we are to him, and remembering what he's called us to helps us to be in a state of preparation, prepared to navigate these difficult topics.
Yeah, right. Because the whole idea is like, it's not a matter of if these topics are going to come up, it's a matter of when. So if we're not preparing, then they will feel very big and overwhelming.
Yeah.
I think what's also interesting about what you're saying is that if we're not in this constant state and routine of resting with God, then we cannot give to our kids or our spouse or our community what I think God wants to do through us. And the only example that I can share, it happened this last week. We had a health scare with one of my kids. We were in the ER for Monday through Wednesday.
Oh my
and
gosh.
It exhausted me, right? Like envision like my bucket is full. When we got home, the adrenaline of what we had gone through, I was completely depleted, right?
Yeah.
So then the rest of the week, I felt like I was in recovery mode. And to be honest, as I'm so convicted, even as we're talking about it, because I did not realize this. Thank you, God, for bringing this to my attention. But like, I never sat to rest and like refill with God. It was like, I was just back in the routine of life, right? But what's interesting is coming out of that, I was so less attentive to what my kids needed and what they were saying, what their bodies were saying, what their emotions were saying, whether or not they were using their words to tell me. Usually, I think I can pick up a lot more on like, okay, you're having really big emotional outbursts. Like, what's the underlying reason behind that? I can usually see that when I'm rested, when I'm not at my threshold, when I have a little bit more margin. But this week, it just felt like I was going head to head with my kids all week. And what I'm realizing is like, I had never stopped to rest with God to encounter these really big things. And so I think likewise, when we are at our max capacity and we're not taking that routine time to rest with God, there's no way that we could be attentive to what our kids are going through. Because the truth is, like, I'm realizing as my kids are getting older, and this is very pointed at kids, but even as our society is growing, as you're building friendships or relationships, like, you won't be able to be as attuned to what the Spirit is trying to show you or what your kids are or are not saying, or questions that you could prompt a conversation with your kids, because you're just trying to hustle through life. You're just trying to make it. Like, this week, I was just trying to make it to Saturday. But it's so funny because then I ran a bunch of errands and never stopped to rest. and I never felt refilled. I never felt like I kind of was able to regain my footing under me. And so I just think that it is something for us to consider of like, okay, the intersection between these two might not be this clear, like, if you practice Sabbath, you will have these answers, but more so exercising this muscle to allow us the space for whatever happened that week to like rest and delight in God so that he can help guide and navigate us, that we can remember who we are, like you were saying, who he is, who we are, what he's called us to be. And maybe there might be a Sabbath rest where God gives you some really, really clear direction on like, here's how you can approach this situation, or here's how, he can change your heart posture. But then there might also be times that it is just simply so that you can rest in him to be prepared for whatever is going to come the next week.
Yep. I think what you're saying makes me think that so much of this kind of stuff happens in our day-to-day, right? Throughout our week. If we think about it like a bucket, like for you going to the hospital with your child, right? Your grief bucket, your fear bucket was filled up so high throughout that week. Even if you hadn't gone to the hospital, it still would have been filled up. So much happens in a week where our grief is triggered, our fear is triggered, our insecurities are triggered, and we just keep going and it starts to overflow in ways that we don't even recognize. Sabbath is a great time to flip those buckets over in God's presence and say, help me make sense of this. Help me sort through it. Help me feel your love through this as I process through this. So Sabbath is a great time to grieve, to process, to feel afraid before God and have him speak some perspective into it. But I think another thing Sabbath does is it teaches us where to go when we have those big emotions, when we need to examine, when we need to gain perspective, or when we need to just be with him to reconnect so that we can continue on. So that doesn't just have to happen on Sabbath. We don't have to relegate that to Sabbath. That can happen on a random Tuesday when you're at the hospital with your kid and you're sad and afraid and feel helpless and all those things. Because you've done it every Saturday or every Sunday for the past 3 months, you know how to turn your heart, your soul inwardly to God and say, I need to just connect with you for a minute. What is true? Who are you? Who am I? What have you called me to? What is my role here? What do I have control over? What do I not have control over? Even in those moments, as sort of a way to help us continue on throughout the moments of life before we can get to Sabbath and fully empty those buckets in his presence.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Ellen, for helping us lay the groundwork here as far as the intersection between sexuality, Sabbath, and where to go from there. In our next episode, we're going to dive into a specific question that we got from one of our listeners that we hope you join us for, because it aids to the understanding of the more we have this routine of meeting God where we're at, how can we bring some of these big questions that we have to his feet, whether on a random Tuesday or on Sabbath. But we do encourage you to try to implement Sabbath this week, whatever that might look like for you. We do have a couple of great resources. Ellen mentioned the Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. That's a great one to start with. So we look forward to hearing how that went for you. If you want to let us know, we'd love to hear it. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.